Well, thank you all for being here, and it's a great honor and pleasure to do this. Okay, good. I feel much better now. And if I seem to go a little bit long, your program will say it's actually 30 minutes, so I just don't want you to think I'm abusing your time. Okay, so anyway, very honored to be here, very appreciative to the organizers. My talk will be on global food security. And what I want to do is I want to talk about, really give you 4 topics. The first one is, what is food security? What does it actually mean? Okay, what are its component parts? The second one is a short history of food security being desirable. Then the next one will be the nature of the current problem and why we must persevere. So I always like to start with this quote, being a wheat breeder, okay? No man or woman qualifies as a statesman who is entirely ignorant of the problems of wheat. Socrates. Now I start with this because of 2 things. Number 1 is, it's a great quote. Okay, number 2 is, at the very foundation of Western civilization, the very cradle, okay, where democracy was being developed, agriculture was of extreme importance. Don't ever forget that, okay? Now, when you look at food security, people are considered food secure when they have the availability and adequate access at all times to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. So what does that really mean? Now, all my life I've worked in food availability. Food must be available in sufficient quantities on a consistent basis. It considers stock and, boy, I tell you what, my glasses are getting bad, and production in a given area and the capacity to bring food from elsewhere through trade or aid. So the bottom line is you have to have a consistent supply of food. You don't have to grow it locally, but you have to have a consistent supply. You don't have to purchase it. It can also be done through aid. Now, what is food access? Food access, people must be able to regularly acquire adequate quantities of food through purchase, home production, barter, gifts, borrowing, or food aid. So they have to be able to access it. And then the last part is food utilization. Consumed food must have a positive nutritional impact on people. It entails cooking, storage, hygiene practices, individual health, water and sanitation, feeding and sharing practices within the household. And the idea here is that you must have food that is available, that you can actually access, and that it's nutritious. So if we all had all the sugar we wanted to get all the calories we needed, that's not food security, right? Okay. Now usually we think of calories, but if I told you that 60% of the world is iron deficient, 30% of the world is zinc deficient, and 190 million children under the age of 5 are vitamin A deficient, that's part of the utilization, okay? Now, I'm going to give you the short history of feeding the world and food security. And this is kind of a play on words because I don't think most of you recognize how novel a concept that truly is, okay? I once asked a historian of science, when did he think the concept that we could feed the world came about? And he said, probably the Age of Enlightenment, 300 years ago, 1700s. So you have 10,000 years of recorded history, and the first part of food security was only considered possible in the last 300 years. Okay? Now, if you think about it, throughout history, poverty and food insecurity were accepted. And they were accepted for 2 reasons. Number 1, for the first 9,700, you didn't think you could do it. And if you could, you weren't really sure everybody was worthy of being fed. That's the sad story. So that everyone living with food security is a new idea, and it's the very thinnest of veneers on human civilization. It's something I want you to remember. Every speech that I ever go to when I listen to graduate students, when they talk about, we're going to feed the world, and then they go on and talk about the science or something else. They don't talk about what it really means to be food secure And one of the greatest challenge is the acceptance that that's a noble goal. So let me just give you some examples, okay? 170 years ago, the Irish potato famine, right? 1/8 of all of Ireland died. 1/8 of Ireland emigrated. One of the greatest economic migrations in history, okay? 170 years ago. Now I said again, remember, food security, the idea you could feed everyone only occurred 300 years ago. That didn't mean everybody accepted it, okay? So Charles Edward Trethelon, who was the Irish Relief Administrator, the person in charge of trying to save the Irish, what was his comment? His comment was, God had sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, and it must not be too much mitigated. It was a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. And he's the person that's supposed to save you. Do you think the concept that maybe not everybody was worthy hadn't sunk in yet? Do you think so? Now, let's go about 100 years ago. K Chesterton wrote a very famous piece on the Irish potato famine. He said it was a tragic necessity that the Irish should remember it, but it was far more tragic that the English forgot it. For he who has forgotten his sin is repeating it incessantly forever. So when you think about, are people worthy of being fed, always remember, don't repeat that sin incessantly. Okay? Now, let's get it 50 years ago. I'm 17 years old. Okay? There was a very important book called The Population Bomb. It was written by Paul Ehrlich, National Academy of Science ecologist, brilliant person. New York Times bestseller for weeks, probably months actually. And in it he wrote that the battle to feed all humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs we embarked upon now. 17 years old, New York Times bestseller, National Academy of Science member. That's the view of the world. Okay? What do? You form the lifeboat response. Now, if you're unfamiliar with a lifeboat, if you don't have enough lifeboats and your ship sinks, what you do is you fill the lifeboats with as many people as you can, and then you push everybody else away and let them drown. And the idea is if the lifeboat capsizes, then everybody drowns, and saving some is better than not losing everyone. Okay? So what were we to do? Well, with starvation looming, and you couldn't fix it, there was nothing that you could do, the only thing you could choose would be who would be in or out of the lifeboat. So whole countries were expected to have massive, unavoidable, and totally acceptable human losses. Hundreds of millions of people, when you're looking at a 3.5 to 4 billion population, you're looking at 2.5% of the global population was expected to starve on the low estimate. And all you were going to do is let them starve. Because there's nothing else you could do, right? Think about that when you think about food security and the history of the concept. Okay, now, how many of you remember the massive famines of the 1970s? Okay, you're actually all wrong. Okay, there were no such famines. Okay, there were minor ones, but never the massive ones. And the reason was for two people. One was Norm Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, there is no Nobel Prize for agriculture. Norm thought there should be, so therefore he created the World Food Prize. And Hank Beechel, an alumnus of the University of Nebraska, is a winner of the World Food Prize. Norm developed the semi-dwarf wheats. Hank developed the semi-dwarf rices. When you put semi-dwarfing genes with the proper management system of irrigation and nitrogen fertilizers, you could feed the world. And that's what they did. 1 billion people are alive today because of what those two men did and their teams, okay? Now, one of the things that Norm said was that the Green Revolution would buy us time. He thought it would give us 25 to 30 years. He was probably off by 10 years. Probably gave us 40 years. But the short answer and the question we have is, are we back to where we were in 1970? That's the question we have to think of. Do we need a second Green Revolution if you believe that food security is a noble gain? Okay? So, I want to show you this picture because just to give you an idea of how important agriculture was. If you look at this picture, I'm going to see if I can do the pointer. This might be interesting. Let me see. Whoops, that didn't do that. Okay, that wasn't right. There we go. That's Hank Beechel, UNL alumnus. This happens to be the head of research, the head of the International Rice Research Institute, Ferdinand Marcos, the president of the Philippines, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president of the U.S. Whoops, pardon me. Let's go back again. LBJ and Marcos were probably talking about the Vietnam War, but they took time to go visit the semi-dwarf rices because they wanted to see what would feed all of Southeast Asia. That's how important it was. Oh, by the way, I love the thought about letting kids dream. When Hank Beechel went to the University of Nebraska, because he grew up in Wahoo, for those of you who are unfamiliar, his dad looked at him as he packed up the car and said, "See you in 2 weeks." That was his dad's motivation to say, "I think you're going to flunk out." Okay? Now, Hank told me that nothing made him so angry as that he was going to stick it out come hell or high water. And I think the short answer is his dad worked, you know. But that's the thing. I'll see you in 2 weeks. That's your dream, kid. Okay? Now, for those of you that are familiar with Give Us This Day, Our Daily Bread, and a Common Prayer, this probably is one of the greatest quotes on agricultural science. Few scientists think of agriculture as the chief or model science. Many indeed do not consider it a science at all. Yet it was the first science that makes all human life possible. And it may well be that before the century is over, the success or failure of science as a whole will be judged by the success or failure of agriculture. It was written in 1974. The Green Revolution was just beginning to have its impact the population bomb already had. Thanks to Norm and Hank, it didn't happen in the 2000s, but it may be more relevant for the 2100s. Okay? Now, you've all seen the 9.5 billion question, right? Everybody knows 2050 we're going to have 9.5 billion people, maybe 9.6 depending on your rounding errors, okay? I always like this one because it shows the demography of it. 2 billion under the age of 15, 6 billion 15 to 64, and those of us that are beyond 64 are going to be the 1.5 billion if we're still here, of course. Okay. But what I want you to think about, again, this is usually a pass-through slide in most talks. What does 9.5 billion people really mean? As a person that's interested in food availability, the first thing you have to understand is 9.5 billion people in the year 2050 are going to eat like 12 billion people today. Okay? So don't worry about the 2 billion that we're adding. They're going to eat like we added 4.5 billion. Now, why is that? Because hopefully we'll be more prosperous. 840 million people are going to bed hungry tonight. Our goal is not to have that same number go to bed hungry in 2050, right? So there are going to be more people being fed. In wheat right now, for every 2/3 of consumption that increases due to population, 1/3 increases due to increased prosperity. Basically, people are going to have better diets, and that's a good thing. More animal protein, all these types of things, okay? Now, the other thing that I want you to think out of this is a 1% gain per year is completely different if you're talking about a 1 ton per hectare crop or a 5 ton per hectare crop. When Norm and Hank were making their increases, they were at 1 ton per hectare. 50 kilograms per hectare was a 5% gain. If you're now at a 5 ton per hectare crop, 50 kilograms per hectare is a 1% gain. So don't let the percents fool you. If you look at the current trends, I'm going to see if I can do this again properly, maybe. This is for developing countries. This is the Green Revolution. You can see the spike in productivity. This is for the developed countries. You can see, again, pretty good genetic gain. In both cases, they're decreasing, okay? The number I want you to remember, if we're going to make it to 2050 and we're going to have food availability, you're going to need 1.4 to 1.7% gain annually. Right now, we're at about 0.9% gain. Okay? Now, what that tells you is if you don't have a plan to increase your rate of gain to 1.4 to 1.7, you have a plan to fail. And in agriculture, we don't want failure. That's not an option. Not when you want to try to feed the world. So the point that comes out of that is a good past is positively dangerous if it makes us content with the present and unprepared with the future. You can't rest on your laurels in agriculture. By the way, that's how you make money in wheat, in case you're wondering, okay? Okay. So, if failure is not an option, what do we have to do? We have to change what we're doing. The status quo is not an option. You're going to have to prioritize what you're going to do and how you're going to invest. Remember, the future belongs to those who invest in it, and also remember it's a global economy. Nobody sits while we're waiting. Everybody's moving forward. You're either going to be on the train or you're not. Doesn't matter. And your investments will most likely have to be much riskier. Higher potential for gain, higher risk. Go back to that same photo. Right after this, LBJ gave a speech, and he said, "You are pointing the way for all of Asia to follow, and I hope they're looking. I hope they are listening, and I hope they are following." The idea being that we have to make sure people are listening if we're going to try to go forward. Now, this is a complicated slide. The only part I want to mention in here is a couple of things. What it says is simply the phenotype, which is what you harvest, is due to the genetics, the environment, and how they interact. The environment can be broken down into weather, which you can't control, but things you can control, such as tillage, pesticides, irrigation, fertilizer, prior cropping history. If you look at this, the question becomes, and you look at gains, where are you going to get your maximum gain? Well, once your fields have been sprayed with herbicides, so they're weed-free, sprayed with fungicides, so they're largely disease-free, insecticides, so they're insect-free, you've captured all the gain. The management will become critically important for sustainability, but the gain will have to more and more come from genetics and working in those sustainable systems. And that's why you see in the developed countries less gain than what you see in the developing countries where they're still capturing all the management capabilities they can. Now, I want to give you two examples of research that's really paid, well, one that's really paid off and one we think is high risk but may pay off. This happens to be in the poorest part of India. And if you see this line here, and maybe you can't see it, but I looked at these trees and they're really weird because it looks like the roots are about 6 feet off the ground. I've never seen a tree that has roots 6 feet off the ground. And then I noticed they're not roots, that's debris. The monsoonal rains came through, lifted all the debris off the field, put it through those trees, the trees act like a comb and caught it, and then the monsoon floods abated, and that's what you have left. What's important here, this is rice with a submergence gene in it. Okay, rice grows in water, but if you submerge it, it'll drown. But there is a gene, single gene, that allows it to survive for 2 weeks underwater. This had the gene, this one didn't have the gene. This crop survived, that crop died. Now, I don't want you to ever think the farmer was stupid. He wasn't. He wanted the seed with the submergence gene in it. He couldn't get it. There just wasn't enough seed, okay? But he did want it. And so this is where our clientele on a global basis needs new technology. And you can make huge differences to avoid risk. Now, the moment I knew that I was doing what I really enjoyed is after we saw those fields, we went to a banyan tree and we talked with all those producers about rice. What's a winter wheat breeder in the poorest part of India? They've never seen a frost, much less snow. doing out there? The same thing Hank Beecher was doing 50 years earlier, talking about rice to people who needed to know about rice. So, really high-risk research. You probably are unaware of it, but the University of Nebraska is the lead institution in North America to try to develop hybrid wheat. We think if we can make hybrid wheat, we can maybe replicate what happened in hybrid corn and hybrid sorghum. But we have a little tougher task to do. You know, we don't do easy, we do tough. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to convert a self-pollinated crop into a cross-pollinated crop. Once we do that, we're going to create heterotic pools. You talk about partnerships. We're getting the chemistry that allows us to do this, to test hybrids from a French company. We're getting our genomics from Kansas State University. We're getting our algorithms and the statistics we need to use that from our collaborators in Germany. We're going to try to find those heterotic pools. When we get all done, it's not good enough to be experimentally perfect. We've got to be able to take it to the field. Norm Borlaug always said, take it to the farmer. We're going to have to develop a commercial scale production system for a crop that's never been hybridized. High risk? You bet. Worth the goal? Absolutely. We got to try things that are different. Okay? If you've never seen what hybrid wheat will look like, that's male sterile, so it has to be cross-pollinated. This is one that has poor restoration. This is what you want in your hybrid, one that's fully restored, fully grain yield, gets all the yield that you want. These are our crossing blocks using our French chemicals. These are the students. Amanda will defend her dissertation in 2 weeks. Nick's defended his master's, now working on his PhD. Now, I told you it's high risk. What happens if we fail? Because quite frankly, in research, you're going to have to expect to fail in a lot of your things. Well, we're going to have learned a tremendous amount about how to choose parents. And that's going to be valuable for pure line breeding. If we fail at hybrids, we're going to learn how to be a better pure line breeder. We're going to learn a lot about the genetics and genomic structure of inbreds and hybrid crops. Hybrids and polyploids, which wheat is, are very rare. We're going to lay a foundation to help us understand that. And we'll have a much better idea of why we failed, so that maybe someone a little younger can take this up at a future time and do it again, and maybe succeed. We don't expect to fail, mind you, but if we do, we have our plans. Now, why we persevere. I always love this quote by T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration. At the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. I may be one of the most applied scientists, if you believe in that term, on this campus, but in my heart, I'm a scientist. Scientists want to understand the world they live in. This is what we do. I want to make it a better world, but at the same time, I want to understand the world we're in. This quote I always love too. You're probably unfamiliar with the Battle of Agincourt. It's an English battle fought by Henry V, one of the greatest battles in English history. I think you may see part of the words in here that make sense. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Ring that bell. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. If you want to understand the community of agricultural researchers, that band of brothers and sisters, we're the thin line that sits there between food insecurity and food security. We would be no other place. We band of brothers and sisters. Now, I love the stories about the children, because this one by Emerson rings home. When duty whispers low, thou must, the youth replies, I can. Everyone who ever works with a graduate student or undergraduate has to be optimistic, because those kids are so optimistic. We can be the change in the world we want to see. And as Einstein said, the highest form of intelligence of mankind is not reason, it's vision. 300 years ago, people thought they could maybe produce enough food to feed the world. That's vision. Now I'm going to end on this slide because I think when you think about what this group was trying to do, If you want to go far, this, by the way, is an old African proverb. If you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. When you think of all the moving parts in agriculture, from those that work on food availability to those that work with food access, the traders and the people that are moving things around, to those that make sure that food is nutritious, and all the policies and everything else, if you want to go far, you have to go together. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and I always like to thank the University of Nebraska for giving me 31 years to have all the fun I could handle. Thank you.